You walk past them every day. They look like you. They talk like you. But something is different. They're not looking at the world. They're reading it. Like a chess player reads the board 3 moves ahead. And while you're deciding what you think about a person, they've already decided what you're worth to them. Most people never see it coming. They notice only after, when the damage is done. When they realize they gave something they never meant to give. When the favor becomes a debt, the compliment becomes a hook, and suddenly they're playing a game they didn't know they entered. So the question becomes unavoidable. How do manipulators actually think? What's the operating system in their minds? 2 ancient minds face this question differently. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while surrounded by ambitious men who watched for weakness. He spent decades in war, plague, betrayal, and noise. Yet he built something no outside force could break, an inner fortress. He kept journals not to become famous, but to remind himself how to remain free when everything demanded obedience. His answer to manipulation was simple. Control what is yours, your judgment, your meaning-making, your choice. Everything else, let it go. NICCOLÒ Machiavelli watched empires collapse. He saw princes with pure intentions get devoured by those with sharper eyes. So he studied not virtue, but reality. He learned to read the game itself, the incentives, the hidden motives, the patterns that predict human behavior before it happens. His answer was different. Understand how manipulators work so you can see their moves before they make them. Today, we're not asking who was right. We're asking what each would tell you about the mind of someone playing you. Because once you understand how they think, they lose their greatest weapon, your blindness. Before we pull back the curtain on manipulation, if you value this kind of thinking, subscribe. We publish weekly on how to see systems before they own you. Now, let's listen to what Marcus and Machiavelli would say.
The gap. How manipulators find your weakness. You can start, Marcus.
Listen to me carefully. The manipulator's greatest power is not what they do to you, it's what they make you believe about yourself. I ruled over millions, I had legions, I had wealth. And yet, the people who caused me the most suffering were not armies, they were the men in my own court, the ones who whispered, who twisted words, who made me doubt my own judgment. For years, I didn't understand why they had so much power over me. I was an emperor. I had the authority to execute them. But I realized something. The manipulator doesn't need your obedience. They need your doubt. Here's how they think, and this is crucial. They're not plotting against you because they're evil. That's the lie we tell ourselves. They're solving their own problem. They need something from you, status, money, compliance, loyalty, and they've decided that getting it through deception is easier than asking directly. So they begin with observation. They watch you, not because they like you, but to find the gap between who you are and who you think you are. That gap is their entry point. The man who presents himself as confident but secretly fears rejection, that's a gap. The woman who claims independence but desperately needs approval, that's a gap. The manager who says she values honesty but fires anyone who disagrees, that's a gap. Once they find that gap, they move into it. They offer you what your gap craves. The rejected man gets offered belonging. The approval-hungry woman gets offered recognition. And in that moment, something happens. You stop thinking clearly. Your judgment, the very thing that keeps you free, becomes clouded by hope, by relief, by the feeling that finally someone understands you. This is where I studied myself very carefully, because I realized I was capable of the same blindness as everyone else. So I asked myself each morning, Where am I vulnerable today? What do I secretly want that I haven't admitted? Where might I be deceived? The manipulator counts on the fact that you'll never ask yourself these questions. They count on you being asleep. But I learned something that changed everything. The moment you can name your own vulnerability, the moment you can say, here is where I want to believe a lie, that vulnerability loses its power over you. I practiced negative visualization. Every morning, I imagined the ways I might be deceived that day. I rehearsed the temptations. I reminded myself that the person offering to fill my gap might be offering poison in a beautiful cup. This is not paranoia. This is clarity. Because the world is full of people solving their problems at your expense. And the moment you accept that fact without bitterness, the moment you see it as simply how humans behave, you become untouchable. The manipulator's power vanishes the moment you no longer need what they're offering, not because you're proud, but because you've learned to offer those things to yourself.
Marcus speaks of discipline and clarity, beautiful ideas, but I watched men with the clearest judgment get crushed by men with blunter minds but sharper instincts. And I learned something he never had to face. Clarity alone doesn't keep you alive. Let me be direct. Marcus is describing how to protect your soul, but the manipulator isn't after your soul. They're after your position, your resources, your leverage. And they don't care how internally free you feel while it's happening. Here's what Marcus gets wrong. He assumes the manipulator is solving a simple problem, that they need money or status or belonging. But that's children's psychology. Real manipulation is much more sophisticated. The genuine manipulator isn't offering you what you secretly want. They're creating the want in the first place. They're not filling a gap you already had, they're cutting a new wound and then bandaging it. I learned this by watching power move in Florence. The real players understood something Marcus missed. Most people don't know what they want until someone shows them it's possible. So the manipulator's first move isn't to observe your weakness. It's to create the context where weakness emerges. They'll invite you to a gathering. They'll introduce you to someone important. They'll show you a possibility you never considered. Now, suddenly, you have a new hunger. And here's the genius of it. You think it came from inside you. You think you discovered something about yourself, but they architected it. Marcus says, know yourself, know your vulnerabilities, don't need things. This is good advice for a monk in a monastery, but you don't live in a monastery. You live in a marketplace. And in a marketplace, the man who doesn't hunger will starve alongside everyone else. The second thing Marcus misses, he assumes you can always choose not to engage. But that's a luxury of power. Most people don't have the option to walk away. The employee can't refuse the manager. The debtor can't ignore the creditor. The person seeking a job can't afford to be suspicious of the interviewer. And that's where real manipulation begins. Not when you have a choice, but when you don't. So here's how the real manipulator thinks. They map the point where you have no escape route. They find the moment when you're desperate enough to compromise what you said you'd never compromise. I saw this in The Fall of Princes. It wasn't the man with the clearest values who survived. It was the man who understood the system well enough to find the hidden exits before he needed them. The manipulator thinks, what does this person need so badly that they'd compromise their judgment to get it? And more importantly, what outside force am I going to create that will make them feel they have no choice? The best manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like inevitability. It feels like you're choosing freely, when in reality, the walls have been closing in for months, and you only noticed when the ceiling was already falling. Marcus teaches you to be clear and free on the inside. That's admirable. But I'll teach you to read the board, because the man who sees the trap before he's in it, he's the one who actually survives.
Marcus says I'm naive about power. Maybe he's right about one thing. Most men will never have the freedom I had. Most will face pressures I never had to face in their intensity. But he mistakes one thing, and it's critical. He's saying the man who remains clear on the inside is like a monk in a monastery. But I was never in a monastery. I was an emperor at war. I faced the exact pressure he's describing, the moment where refusal means collapse. And here's what he still doesn't see. The moment you accept that you have no choice, you've already lost. Because what Machiavelli calls reading the board is just learning to play the game better. And the game never stops. The man who wins through cleverness must be clever forever. He's built his house on sand. But the man who says, I will not do this thing, even if it costs me everything, he's made a decision that gives him freedom. Not freedom from consequence, freedom from needing to keep playing. Machiavelli thinks I'm saying refuse everything, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying know the difference between what you can lose and what you cannot. You can lose money, you can lose position, you can lose health, you can even lose your life. But the moment you decide there are things you cannot lose, your integrity, your clarity, your right to your own judgment, you become something that cannot be manipulated. Because the manipulator's power depends on you believing you have to choose between survival and self-respect. But that's a false choice. I chose both, not because I was lucky, but because I understood that a man who knows what he cannot do is infinitely more powerful than a man who knows only what he can do. Machiavelli learned to read the system. That's useful. I learned to remain whole within the system. That's survival. And here's the part where Machiavelli and I finally agree. The manipulator is counting on your desperation. The moment you're no longer desperate, the moment you know you can walk away, everything changes. But Machiavelli thinks you create that by building leverage and options. I'm saying something deeper. You create it by deciding what is not for sale. That's what makes you dangerous to the manipulator. Not because you're clever, but because you're unpredictable in the way that matters. You cannot be bought.
Both men are describing the same threat from different angles. Marcus says the manipulator finds the gap between who you are and who you think you are. Your job is to know yourself so well that there is no gap. Machiavelli says the manipulator creates circumstances that make you feel you have no choice. Your job is to understand the game well enough to create choices where none seem to exist. Marcus protects your soul from ownership. Machiavelli protects your agency from extinction. The rare person uses both. They know themselves deeply and they read the board carefully. They have integrity and they understand incentives. But here's where the two approaches must split. When forced to choose, Marcus chooses internal freedom. Machiavelli chooses external power. The question becomes, which will save you?
The cost of the game. What manipulation does to both players. Now you, Marcus.
Let me tell you something most people never notice about the manipulator. They're actually easier to see than you think, because they don't understand one critical thing about human nature, and their blindness is their weakness. They assume everyone is motivated by the same things they are. They assume everyone wants power or money or status or security. So they look at you and they ask, what does this person want? And they watch for the signs. But here's what they miss. Some people, and this was revolutionary to me, some people want meaning more than they want comfort. They want alignment more than they want advantage. The manipulator cannot fathom this. They'll offer you money when what you actually want is integrity. They'll offer you status when what you actually want is to know you acted rightly. And in that moment, their entire system breaks down. I realized this about the ambitious men in my court. They were plotting against me, offering me flattery, making me promises. But every single one of them assumed I wanted what they wanted. They assumed I was desperate for their loyalty because loyalty was their currency. But I didn't need their loyalty. I needed clarity about whether they could be trusted. That's a completely different thing. And the moment they realized I didn't need them, that I'd be fine whether they stayed loyal or plotted against me, they lost their power. Here's the second thing about how manipulators think. They underestimate the cost of their own manipulation. When a man builds his life on deception, he has to keep deceiving forever. He has to remember every lie. He has to manage every relationship through a lens of manipulation. He has to assume everyone is doing to him what he's doing to others. This creates a kind of prison. The manipulator is never truly at rest. He can never fully trust anyone. He can never relax, because at any moment, someone might be manipulating him the way he manipulates others. I observed this constantly. The men most focused on deceiving others were the most paranoid. They couldn't enjoy their victories because they assumed everyone was plotting. They had won through cunning, but they lived like prisoners. And I thought, this is the real cost of manipulation. Not that you get caught, but that you can never stop. The man who plays by the rules, who says what he means and means what he says, he has freedom. He sleeps without fear. He can trust his friends genuinely. He can relax. The manipulator can never do any of these things. So when I realized this, I made a decision. I would be someone who could be trusted completely, not because I was weak, but because it made me stronger. If you know I always tell you the truth, you have to take my words seriously. You can't dismiss them as deception. If you know I keep my word, you have to assume I'll be there. You can't prepare for my betrayal. This made me more powerful than any manipulator because I'd eliminated their main weapon, the uncertainty about whether they could trust their own minds.
Marcus speaks beautifully about the peace that comes from virtue. I don't deny it exists. I've seen it. It's even admirable. But he's confusing two things, and it's critical we separate them. He's saying manipulators are prisoners to their own deception. They live in fear, they can't trust, and therefore the virtuous man is actually stronger. But this is confusing happiness with power. The manipulator might not sleep well, he might carry paranoia, but he has the crown. He makes the decisions. He bends the world to his will. And in the real world, that matters more than inner peace. I watched this over and over. The virtuous man, the one with Marcus's approach, he was respected, but he wasn't feared. And in the absence of love, fear is the more reliable lever. More crucially, Marcus is describing something that only works if everyone else operates by his rules, but they don't. The moment a virtuous man plays with a manipulator, something has to give. Because the manipulator doesn't accept the rules of the virtuous man. He plays by his own. Here's what Marcus missed. In a world where deception is possible, honesty is a weakness. Not because honesty is weak in itself, but because it's exploitable. The honest man will tell you his weakness. The honest man will keep his word even when it hurts him. The honest man believes that virtue is its own reward. And the manipulator uses every single one of these things against him. I'm not saying Marcus is wrong about the inner peace. I'm saying he's wrong about its relationship to power. The question isn't, how do I feel? The question is, do I get what I want? Now, here's the deeper part, and this is where my observation becomes important. The best manipulators, the ones who actually build empires, not just small deceptions, they're not cynics. They understand something Marcus touched on but didn't fully grasp. They understand that appearance is reality in human affairs. This is the genius I learned from watching power move. Men don't judge by internal virtue. They judge by what they perceive, and those are not the same thing. So the sophisticated manipulator doesn't deceive for the sake of deception. He manages perception so that people align with his interests. He appears honest, not because he is, but because honesty appears to him to be useful. He appears strong, not because he lacks doubt, but because strength appears to him to work. The difference is subtle but total. He's not lying about his character. He's curating what you see of it. And here's the thing that makes this different from mere deception. It's actually hard to refute, because part of it is true. He is strong in some ways. He has kept some promises. He does care about some things. But he's chosen what you see and what remains hidden. And that's real power. Marcus thinks this is a prison. I think it's simply how the world works. The man who sees it and works with it, he thrives. The man who refuses to see it, believing that virtue will be rewarded, he gets crushed, and then blames the world for being unfair. The manipulator isn't a prisoner to his system. He's the architect of it. And while he might not have Marcus's peace of mind, he has something Marcus never had, the ability to bend events to his will.
Both men are revealing a fundamental split in how to survive in a world of manipulators. Marcus would disengage cleanly. He'd be clear. He'd move on. Machiavelli would orchestrate a visible response that reveals the betrayal to others. He's teaching a lesson not to the betrayer, but to the observers. The question is, what environment are you in? In a small team of people you trust? Be Marcus. Clean disengagement, clarity. In a large organization where perception is power, Machiavelli has a point. The visible response teaches everyone else how to treat you. But here's where they converge. In both cases, your real power comes from the fact that the betrayal doesn't actually hurt you. You don't need revenge because you don't need them. Now we see the real disagreement, and it matters less than you think. Marcus is saying the manipulator is weaker than you because his power depends on your ignorance. Machiavelli is saying, no, the manipulator is stronger than you because your virtue is his weapon. They're both right, and they're both describing real dangers. The question is, which danger are you actually facing? Here's a framework that brings them together. When you encounter manipulation, 4 things determine whether to use Marcus's approach or Machiavelli's. Variable 1. What's at stake? Your soul or your survival? If someone is asking you to betray what you stand for, that's Marcus's domain. You choose integrity. The cost might be real, but the cost of losing yourself is worse. If someone is threatening your livelihood, your safety, or your basic security, that's Machiavelli's domain. You adapt. You read the incentives. You protect your position. Variable 2. Do you have time or are you in crisis? Marcus thinks in decades. Machiavelli thinks in days. When you're in immediate danger, you cannot afford Marcus's internal work. You must act. You must read the system. You must survive today. But when you have time, you can afford to build the internal fortress Marcus describes. You can afford to be clear about your values. Variable 3. Are you alone or observed? Machiavelli's rules apply in public. Manage perception. Control the narrative. Don't show weakness. But in solitude, with yourself, with your closest people, you can afford Marcus's honesty. You can afford to be vulnerable. You can afford to admit doubt. And variable 4, do you have options? If you can walk away, choose integrity. Be Marcus. If you cannot walk away, use Machiavelli's tools to create options. Then, once you have options, go back to Marcus.
Testing loyalty. Can you ever really know who to trust?
Your turn, Machiavelli.
This is where the practical question becomes urgent. Testing loyalty before trusting with something big is not manipulation. It's literacy. Here's how it works. You don't ask the big question first. You ask a small favor that costs them something. You observe. Do they follow through? Do they gossip? Do they try to leverage it for something? When a man is willing to inconvenience himself for a small ask, and he does it without broadcasting it, you've learned something crucial. You've learned that he can be relied upon, not in the sense of obligation, but in the sense of consistent behavior. I watch this in politics constantly. The men who jumped to every small request without hesitation, they were unreliable with big ones. Why? Because they were seeking approval for everything. They were fragile. But the man who said yes to the small request, did it quietly, and didn't expect praise, that's a man you can build with. So I would design a small test, not something dishonest, something real, a small project, a confidential matter, and I would watch how they handle it.
I understand what Machiavelli calls testing, but I want to be clear about what this actually is. It's manipulation. Let me say it plainly. You're creating a scenario to learn about someone without their consent. You're observing them in a situation they don't know is a test. Now, Machiavelli would say, this is just being careful. And I'd agree it's understandable, but let me tell you what I learned from doing this differently. I didn't test people. I asked them directly. I would say to someone, I need to trust someone with something important. Do you think I can trust you? And more, can you be honest? Do you think you're reliable? Where might you let me down? This is uncomfortable. Most people don't know how to answer it. But here's what happens. The people who answered honestly, who could admit their limitations, they became trustworthy. And the people who couldn't answer honestly, they revealed themselves through their inability to be honest. In other words, I let the test be the conversation itself. The advantage is I'm not deceiving anyone. I'm being direct, and the people who can handle that directness are the ones who can actually be trusted.
Marcus, you're assuming people have enough self-awareness to answer honestly. In my experience, most people lie to themselves first. So asking them directly gets you their version of the truth, not the truth itself. When I watch someone under small pressure, I learn how they actually behave, not how they think they behave. But I'll concede something. If the person is sophisticated enough to understand what Marcus is saying, then his approach works. The direct conversation is a form of testing. The person reveals themselves through how they handle the honesty. But with most people, they'll tell you they're trustworthy and then betray you 6 months later. Not because they're lying consciously, but because they don't know themselves.
You've just revealed something important, Machiavelli. You're assuming people can't know themselves, so you judge them by their behavior under pressure. But I'm saying people can know themselves if you give them permission and safety to do so. The direct conversation gives them that, and those who rise to it, who become honest about their limitations, they become trustworthy not because I'm observing them, but because the conversation itself. This is why I preferred directness. It wasn't naivete. It was because I understood that how you relate to people shapes what they become.
So let's return to the original question. How do manipulators think? Marcus says they think you're asleep. They believe you don't know yourself. They're counting on finding a gap between who you are and who you think you are. Machiavelli says they think you're predictable. They believe everyone is motivated by the same things. They're counting on reading the board better than you do. Both are partially right. But here's what both would agree on. The manipulator's power disappears the moment you truly know yourself and understand the system you're in. It's not enough to be Marcus, internally aligned but blind to how power actually moves. It's not enough to be Machiavelli, strategically aware but corrupted by constant deception. The rare person is both, internally free and externally aware, able to say no when needed, able to read incentives when necessary, able to see a manipulation coming a month away because they understand how people think, but most critically, able to remain themselves while doing it. Here's your challenge for this week. Notice one moment where you feel pressure. Pressure to perform, to impress, to comply, to sell yourself. Pause. Ask yourself, is this pressure coming from outside or have I created it inside myself? That single question, asked genuinely, begins to close the gap that manipulators exploit. Because once there's no gap between who you are and who you think you are, you become someone who cannot be bought or cornered. Not through virtue alone, not through strategy alone, but through clarity.
If this made you see the world a little differently, subscribe. We analyze these ancient strategies every day. Full reading list, resources, and deeper frameworks in the description. You've been watching The Virtue Paradox.